What is happening, team? Welcome to another episode of Anabolic Radio with your host, Coach Hawk. And today I am joined by none other than himself, Dr. Eduardo Oliveira De Souza. The doc has his PhD in biodynamics of human movement and is a professor at Tampa University. Those of you who've been listening to the podcast, you know that Chris Bearcat is also from Tampa University, and you're probably familiar with the background of the lab. And the doc has contributed a significant amount to our understanding of hypertrophy and physique development. And for today's episode, we are going to dive into some topics that have been really popular in the industry at the moment. And without further ado, I want to give the floor to you, Doc. How are you doing today?
Great, man. Thanks for having me. Yeah, so far so good.
Absolutely, happy to hear. So, I know we've had some back and forth. We haven't had the pleasure of meeting in person yet, but we've had some back and forth through our DM exchanges.
Yeah.
And one of the topics that I wanted to speak about on the episode is our understanding of hypertrophy and the different variables that contribute to us improving our strength or improving our muscle size. And you have recently put out or been an author on a paper that has caused a lot of people to challenge their perspectives when it comes to volume research. So I know if we were to look back at things 10 years ago, most of the consensus was around volume being the main driver for hypertrophy. Now we kind of know that it's a little bit more nuanced. We know that, mechanical tension is an important contributor to that as well. In addition to that, we know the importance of muscle protein synthesis, and not only can we augment increases in muscle protein synthesis via variables related to our nutrition, but just by simply resistance training. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the sort of change that's happened in the industry and just the growth and understanding of hypertrophy.
Yeah, sure. No, that's a great question. And the research has been evolving in this field. Like you said, I was the one in the past that used to say that, yeah, volume is the primary driver of muscle hypertrophy. But from a mechanistic standpoint, hypertrophy takes place when protein synthesis outweighs breakdown, right? And you touch on something really important. As long there is sufficient mechanical tension to increase protein synthesis, and that over time, that would lead to muscle hypertrophy. So I think the one of the like we have a few changes. Probably the biggest paradigm change was the load does not determine hypertrophy, and that's when proximity to failure come at a play, right? So or came at a play. So we started to look at also proximity to failure. And regarding volume, the studies in the past from acute standpoint, if you look at acute studies, we know that one single set is already enough to increase protein synthesis, but three sets increased more, and that increase also lasts longer. So we that was kind of a higher volume, and then the chronic studies comparing three sets versus one set, they also went to the same direction. We had a like a not like a 5 years ago, another study comparing kind of in untrained people, also comparing like 18 weekly sets versus something around 10, 12. And they found that the benefits of muscle hypertrophy also was associated with what we call ribosome biogenesis. To translate protein, we need the machine to do that. And that machine is the ribosomes they attach, because protein synthesis is mRNA translation. As long as the ribosome attached, you're going to read that code with actin and myosin and build a new protein. There are other processes after that, but pretty much that's what the volume culture with higher volume or volume being important, because we do have studies highlighting that, yeah, volume plays a role. But I think now we probably are more about, okay, load's not so important as long the level of effort is equated. So that means if you are doing 3 by 15, 1-2 rep shy to failure versus 3 by 6 with 1-2 shy to failure, muscle you grow in the very comparable manner. So proximity to failure is one key variable, and it seems to be even more important when it comes to low load training. Seems when you train with a moderate load, like a 10 below, like a 5 to 10 reps repetition with a 2 RNR or 2 failure. So it seems to proximity to failure or going to failure is not that important when you are training with a moderate heavier loads. It seems to be more important with a light load training. So again, proximity to failure is one key component of hypertrophy at this point. A certain we still trying to figure out. It seems that as long as you reach that threshold for protein synthesis, muscle you grow. But yeah, there is a requirement for a certain volume. I think we can always say that yes, usually 15 sets would grow more. 15 weekly sets would grow more muscle than 5. If you talk about training people, the big question is when you extrapolate to extreme volume studies. So I know you're going to touch on that. But again, I think now, like, yes, we know that the primary driver is the protein synthesis. As long that outweighs breakdown in the long-term muscle you growth, there are different variables or combination. I think we still have a way more questions because there are countless ways to increase protein synthesis, and I think we have studied just a few. But and I always say that it's not because something was not studied yet, we can say that doesn't work, or it's not because there is lack of evidence, you have a lack of an effect. But again, I like to say that there are countless ways to activate protein synthesis, and it seems that volume, proximity to failure. If you talk about muscle architecture, if you consider the muscles as a whole, the exercise selection is a really important variable because the regional muscle hypertrophy and progress overload. I think, again, sometimes I keep saying that. I think sometimes for hypertrophy, people focus on variables that don't matter too much, right? Like you don't need to train heavier to grow more muscle. You don't need to get so strict to training system or method or technique. But we know, like, again, those are the variables that I would put my money when it comes to hypertrophy.
Fantastic points. And just to recap, so it's not only the importance of volume, but it's also the combination of other variables such as proximity to failure and also accounting for rest periods between sets. So what methods do we have for us to qualify a set as, okay, this is a significant set. We induced a lot of mechanical tension through this set versus just a set where someone's just simply moving the weight from point A to point B without much intent as to how they're moving that weight from point A to point B.
So how you gauge working set as a hard set? That's a good question. I must say that trained people, they are better at gauging how close, near to failure they are. And again, you can use like a RP's 0 to 10, right? The rate of perceived exertion scale. And that pretty much where repetition reserve came from. So that means if you have a 0 is nothing at all, 10 is your maximal strength exertion or force exertion. If you are rating that set as number 8, like an 8 out of 10, that gives you 2 reps in reserve. That means you interrupted the set, but you could have done 2 more reps. So we stopped the set at that moment with 8 reps, but for example, you could have done 2 more. I think 8, 9 out of 10 is a good way to evaluate it. However, that again, we know that the studies and when compare failure to not failure training, a recent study came out again highlighting that we don't need to go to failure, but usually the studies, what they do is kind of every set performed to failure versus no set to failure. Just like the studies when they compare, right, failure versus no failure. What we do in the lab, we usually train the sets with a 2 R&R, and then the last set performed to failure. So occasionally you might go to failure just to see if you are rating effort in the right way. Again, I think a good way, we have a technology in the lab. I know when to drop X% of your velocity compared to the first rep. I can also get even more precisely. I can say that, yes, you drop like a 40%. You're really close to failure at this point. Like that was the speed for your first rep. And then for the rep you stopped it was like a 40% drop. Yet you definitely were close to failure. But again, I think it requires some experience. But we all know that when the movement starts to slowing down, you have a few reps to do. You have a few reps left in the tank. But I think it's kind of consensus that yes, 2 reps in reserve is considered a hard set.
Great points, great points. And there's a lot of practical limitations when it comes to training to failure, like the doc had just mentioned, one, your experience level. And I think this is something that's really important. If you dive into literature, it's important to not only read the paper and understand the limitations of it, but it's also important to understand the practical aspect to that. So for someone who's a beginner, they may not have the competence or proficiency developed for taking a set close to failure, or even knowing what that feels and looks like. Whereas someone who's a bit more experienced, they obviously have that proficiency developed. So it's important to take that into account, and you can't really know where your true limits lie without taking a set to failure semi-frequently. And I think it is also incredibly important, Doc. I know you said we use velocity measurements to gauge people's proximity to failure, but people don't have TEMS units in gyms.
Yeah.
So a good practical application of that for many people could look like, hey, is your concentric speed slowing down in the exercise, or is your eccentric speed speeding up? So I personally, from a coaching perspective, I help my clients standardize that by implementing tempo and using that. And are there any limitations or drawbacks to using tempo within exercises? Let's say, for example, even at the extreme end, if people are utilizing super longer eccentric speeds.
Yeah. So before answering your question, I think like you said, like occasionally going to failure is really it is important to me, and we need to highlight or point it out that yes, the studies have shown that there is no benefit going to failure, but not detrimental effect. So I think that's really, really important. So, and again, the studies, like I said, they compare every set performed to failure versus no set to failure. So that means once in a while, to kind of for track progression, you go to and evaluate your ability to gauge effort level. I think it doesn't hurt. And the studies, yes, there's a downside of our field. The studies are quite short in duration, but usually studies with 8, 10 weeks performing every set to failure have not reported any detrimental effect. So don't be afraid to hit failure once in a while with one set for your fingerprint core exercise. So the studies, the rep tempo is something we have performed a study here in the lab as well. We do have a meta-analysis showing that, and that's crazy number, varying rep tempo from, and again, repetition tempo, think about that, right? the time to complete one repetition, and then you can break down repetition into phases, concentric, isometric, eccentric. We assign a number for each of those phases, and usually we say like, oh, that's like a 3 seconds rep tempo, 1 second concentric, 0 isometric, 2 eccentric, right? Just for audience have a glimpse of rep tempo. So as I was saying, the meta-analysis that the number was quite crazy, that half like a repetition, the whole repetition lasting from half second all the way to 8 seconds, they have not found differences in hypertrophy. So that means you can be more loose or more flexible. I think is a more appropriate word. And again, I think is if a rep tempo, like I said, you have that huge range that does not impact hypertrophy. I think you can use rep tempo as a sense to gauge effort, or like, okay, let's standardize the repetition tempo. When you slow down your concentric, that's an indicator that the effort level is increasing. But I don't recall. I know we had like a slow, they call like a slow tempo training, and was like 10. I don't recall if that was the correct name. It was like a 10 seconds eccentric. When you do 10 seconds eccentric, the performance or the load drops big time, right? I like to say that let the load dictate the tempo. Okay, so I think that's a good way. And then you can use the concentric phase to gauge effort. Because when you start to manipulate the tempo too much, that means you are dropping too much the tension as well. And the studies have not indicated that increasing the time to complete a rep increases hypertrophic adaptations. I think that's something, again, tempo, you can be more flexible and can be a proxy of effort. Definitely, we use that a lot in performance settings as well. But again, it can be one more way to evaluate progression, effort, and so on and so forth.
Fantastic points. Tempo is just as important as the load you use for an exercise. And I don't think I would be able to get my clients as good as results if I didn't really utilize it in their programming. So yeah, great points. And I think to the recent paper that was published on the 52-week set, I think one of the important things to consider is that it doesn't have to be an extreme progression in your set volume. But what I took from that study was, okay, even small progressions in set volume can lead to improvements. So I think that's a really great point. And to kind of steer in another direction, something that's been very popular on the socials lately, and a lot of people making absolute and black and white claims from it, is this longer muscle length training and partials being represented as full range of motion training. So I would love to give you the floor and hear your thoughts on that.
Ah, man, that's a hot topic now, right? Okay, how gonna start with this? So I would say that despite most studies in untrained people, we do have evidence to say that it seems that training muscles at their longer lengths might enhances hypertrophy, right? We think that's something. Again, I would love to see more studies. All those studies, if you talk about the mile studies from the famous late curve and the seated leg curve as well, we had a study on all those studies with longer muscle training muscles at their longer lengths. They utilized untrained people, but there is something there, because quite often those studies, what they found is when the muscle was trained at their longer lengths, the hypertrophy response was enhanced. So I think the problem is the leap of extrapolating that to all exercises for a given muscle group. I think that's one problematic. And that's the jump people do quite often. I like to say the leaping logic based on one study, and now you should apply that towards all your exercises for a given muscle group. So I think that's one point that is not what the research is telling you to do. That's important. I also must say that we have a compelling evidence. I don't like when they hear like, oh, full range of motion is how they say, like, overrated. I don't think so, because it's where you have a most compelling evidence, because the studies have been using full range of motion, and you have been measuring muscle growth through full range of motion. Where you need more research now, and we started, it's not new, the partial thing, right? We're gonna get to the lengthening bias, the partial lengthening partials bias, but it's not new studying the partial repetition, right? So you just like do 1/4 of your full repetition or full range of motion. And when you think about that, again, for performance, there is a very important specific component. Like if you're concerned about your strength, full range of motion seems to do better compared to partial range of motion. And now, more recently, we had the buzz with lengthening partials for hypertrophy, and quite often we hear like lengthening partial is better for hypertrophy, or to maximize hypertrophic adaptations, you should do lengthening partials. And that's the part as a scientist and looking at the data and the body of evidence, because again, the strong of our conclusions arises from a collective body of well-conducted research. I always like to say that. And when it comes to lengthening partials, I don't think it fits that category, that we have a collective body of well-conducted studies. I'm going to give you a few examples. I'm going to touch on a meta-analysis that people use to propose lengthening partials as a better training scheme. So GOTO or GOTO, I don't know how to pronounce it, GOTO, is a classic study that found that lengthening partials was better. But again, they utilize trained people. We have been measuring muscle hypertrophy in the lab with trained people, and usually I don't see a 2-digit change. Like it's very like something between 5 to 8% on average, sometimes like this. Some people grow a little bit more, some people grow a little bit less, but the GOTO study, they found a 50. So that's insane muscle growth. And even for the full range of motion, they found 20 something, that regardless, if you talk about the lengthening partials or if you talk about full range of motion, for me, that is too much muscle growth, which we have not seen those in the other studies or the newer studies. I know I think that was the study they kind of they use a formula or equation based upon the arm circumference. So probably there was a systematic error inflating the gains for both conditions. But then when you include that study in a meta-analysis, that study per se might change the whole result of a meta-analysis. And now the meta-analysis that was published, I think was 2023, and pretty much, right, they look at performance, full range of motion versus partial range of motion. And then they did a subgroup analysis looking at short bias and long bias, right? Like partial short and partial long bias exercises. So two things about the meta-analysis, and that's sometimes what bothers me a little bit. The quote-unquote evidence-based community on social media, they have, like I say, a selective criticism. They are very good at criticizing some papers or topics, depends on the topic and or who published the topic. And if someone else publishes something, that's silent. I like to say, if the meta-analysis about partial range of motion, the lengthening partials, right? Because they did the subgroup analysis. If that meta-analysis was about periodization, the quote-unquote evidence-based community, they would hammer, they would rip apart that meta-analysis. And people, again, it's not personal. I know a few authors. It's always about discussing the evidence and what they are proposing, right? So that meta-analysis for hypertrophy, they said they used 8 papers. When I read, I only could find 7. Still not a problem. That's fine. You can download. The good thing about meta-analysis, you need to pre-register. You can download everything. I did. I looked at a few things there. Then with the subgroup analysis, before the subgroup analysis, for meta-analysis, systematic reviews and meta-analysis, it's really important the quality, assess the quality of RCT. And that's, I like to say, we cannot blame the researchers who published, but the quality of RCTs in our field is still low. We have a long way to go. We are a new field as a scientific field, right? The exercise science is a new field. And again, the quality of RCTs is really, really low. And they used a very, I'm going to say a little bit more permissive, more flexible assessment tool. If they would use like Crocaine, for example, or Pedro from Prisma, they probably would not use all the studies they included. So still, the scale was all the way to 12, and the average rating for hypertrophy study was 5 out of 12. 5 out of 12, we all agree, is not good grade. It's not good at all. So those studies were included there. For the subgroup analysis, they included, again, I look at the individual effect sizes because I could not figure out how many studies based on the effect sizes and the studies. I'm assuming, because that was something was not clear as well, what studies they assume or used as lengthening partial studies. So that was not clear in the whole meta-analysis. But if I look at the graph, I can figure out the individual effect sizes. Like they may have used 340 studies. So, and the bottom line is in math or in stats, we always deal with a probability. It's quite hard to say, oh, that's the real difference between two conditions. If you compare full range of motion or lengthening partials. So usually what we do, based on the data we have, we calculate what we call a confidence interval, in which we express our certainty or uncertainty about an effect. If a 0 is inside that interval, that means the effect or difference you are looking at can be 0, nada, right? And every time, so you have an confidence interval that crosses 0, you can say that effect can be 0. You are 95%. That's that's the range or the true difference lies within. And if a 0 is there, that means that 0 can be the difference. So that analysis, their confidence interval crossed 0. That means you cannot say what the only thing, all things considered, about the quality of the studies, one huge effect size that was not clear how they deal with that effect size, like a kind of an outlier pushing in favor. I'm assuming it's the Goto study I mentioned, because the effect size is way bigger compared to all the other studies. So the only thing they could say about that meta-analysis is consider the low quality of the studies and the few studies available in this field. At this point, we cannot say that lengthening partials is better or full range of motion is better than lengthening partials. That would be the correct interpretation. And what surprised me when I read the paper and the discussion, they were kind of pushing for lengthening partials as better. And so many people on social media using that meta-analysis to say lengthening partial technique is better than full range of motion. That meta-analysis, again, I keep saying, does not support such a claim. And even if it was true, the effect size was trivial. That means the effect is really, really small. So that means they would, again, we would need to calculate what you call the smallest worthwhile change to see the meaningful, the meaningful or the practical relevance of that difference. So again, the effect size is trivial. The effect is not significant. 0 is inside. We cannot say the lengthening partials technique is better or lengthening partial bias exercise is better than full range of motion based upon that meta-analysis. But again, what surprised me is the dead silent with a quote-unquote evidence-based community about that. If that meta-analysis was about periodization, man, they would rip that apart. So, and then we had two recent, and to be honest, like the last study with a CAVS, I think you probably are familiar with that study. Italo Cassaro is my friend. We talk on weekly basis. And even the first author, he's collaborating with researchers from Norway, if I'm not mistaken. They're doing pretty cool because we keep saying that there is something about calves and stretching. That muscle, we don't know if the muscle architecture or the exercises facilitate you prolong the eccentric to intersect stretching or to lengthening partials. It's easier, right? So, for example, if you're gonna do lengthening partials with a squat, the breathing, right, would be if you stay just like with a heavy load, just doing quarter squat, even to breathe would be way harder. So some exercises might be easier to implement lengthening partials. But that study from my friend with a calves, and that's another problem. I keep saying just representing data in percentage base is misleading if you do not show the absolute differences for the audience. Because there are two takes for the CAVS study. And like I said, the PI there, the first author, he is a topic he's very interested to. He keeps studying the topic, but he's not that excited about lengthening partials. Like we need, like, again, I'm not saying, hey, forget about it, it's useless. I'm just saying the claims that I keep hearing, research does not support such claims. That's what I keep saying. It might be 1-2 in the box down the line with the collective body of a well-conducted studies, and that might be 1-2 in the box, one more. But for that study, the CAVS study, there are two takes for that study. And what I heard quite often, oh, lengthening partials in the CAVS study produced twice muscle growth as full range of motion because was 15% versus 7%, right? Was pretty much the double. And I always like to use, let me see if people can see here. So when you compare, the difference was, again, was one group increased 0.24 centimeters, the other group increased 0.12. So the difference is, I don't know if people can see it, but it's something like this. You see, it's something like this. That would be 1 centimeter right here, right? That's 1 centimeter. That would be 0.10 centimeter. Is that above the measurement error? Is that above the smallest worthwhile change? You see the things, again, that's how my mind goes when I look at data and like, yeah, we have something, let me look at, let me read the paper. And again, it's such a small difference, but percentage-wise, and we are comparing the same study, the same muscle, the same locations. Even when you compare different studies, for me, just presenting percentage change, for me, is misleading without the absolute change. Like we need, what was the actual growth? Centimeter base, millimeters, whatever unit you want to use. But okay, percentage base it can be something like a 15, but it's 0.1 centimeter, like 0.12 to be more precise. So again, is an area that another thing that I forgot to say, studies are very limited to certain muscle groups. Would all muscle groups benefit from lengthening bias exercise? Maybe not. again, I think it's worth to include in your exercise routine when you think about exercise selection. Exercise variation for me, as we said earlier, is one of the key variables when it comes to hypertrophy, because regional muscle hypertrophy, not just for, not just regional, right? Because regional means that if you think about when you measure like a anterior type thickness, we use the femur as a reference, and we know that some exercises they might induce, they target the same muscle, but induce muscle growth more mid to proximal. They grow all the muscle, but primary mid to proximal. Some exercise more mid to distal portion, right? So again, that's why the bodybuilders figured it out way before us. I'm not anti-science because I'm a scientist, but sometimes people don't like. But hey, bodybuilders figured that out way before us. Way before we started our studies, they were bigger. Even if you consider the confounding factors with steroids, whatever, but even the natural, they were bigger back then. So again, varying exercise is a very important training variable when you want to maximize muscle growth. But I think that's the leaping logic saying that everything now should be lengthening biased. I think a good exercise selection would expose the muscle to all different short bias, length bias, and so on. I think that is my stand for exercise selection. And the body of literature is not there yet to propose that lengthening partials are better than full range of motion. Down the line, it might, to be honest, it might be not different with a well-controlled studies. But at this point, we don't have evidence to say that's better. And the studies that favored lengthening partials, they have a serious limitations. And that's another problem with people sometimes presenting information on social media. They downplay limitations or they emphasize too much depending on their bias.
I love it. Fantastic points. A lot to recap. First of
Yeah.
all, you ripping up that paper, it makes me question how it got past reviewers, right? And I think some of the authors of that paper, or this is how you should approach the training, they're not as cautious as you are with making these claims. And so it's interesting when you're like, hey, if you look at the effect size, it's quite trivial. So
It is
um, that's interesting, and I think this brings up the question of you know, you had previously just touched on how everyone is doing longer muscle length based training, and it's almost like they abandoned what they thought they knew would produce results. And when I'm designing a training program, it's almost never I'm going to include all long muscle length based exercises, or I'm going to include exercises that have more of a mid to lengthen challenge with their resistance profile. It's okay. Like if I know a hack squat and a barbell squat are both going to be a mid to lengthen challenge for the quads, it would make more sense for me from an efficiency standpoint to program an additional exercise that maybe targets the areas in the range of motion or the resistance profile that the subsequent exercise is not targeting. That's just how I've always approached program design. I don't think,
Yeah, you're trying to cover everything, right? Like if I can have two exercises that provide different load resistance profile, different lengthening biases, and so on. Why not use like using two different as a insurance policy, right? Like then just put a two exercise that they have a very similar load resistance profile. The lengthening bias is very similar as well. I think that's the right approach. I think that's what a good coach supposed to do, and especially considering accounting for the client preferences, training statuses, and so on, right? Like is one exercise selection might be very good for client A, might not be good for client B because lifestyle, time constraints and those kind of things. Uh, I, I keep it, again, I'm not so active on social media, but it seems that every time now people are saying like, oh, training muscle at their long lengths, do lengthening partials, maximize hypertrophy. That's what you're supposed to do. I think we are not there yet. And
Mm.
again, in hypertrophy, right? Like because it's a bold claim, like a lengthening partials grows more muscle than full range of motion. In hypertrophy, it's just ask people around or people you know, like when it comes to hypertrophy, can you point to one thing that's better than another something else? It is. We don't have we I would love to see like, oh, we know for sure this is better for hypertrophy than doing supersets better for hypertrophy than traditional, or doing myo rep or whatever. But don't have, as long volume is equated, everything pretty much the same. uh, for me still it is a stretch. It is a bold statement.
No pun intended.
Yeah, no, no pun intended. It's like literally stretch. No pun intended. That's correct. Yes.
And I think it's also important to consider individual responses to certain protocols, right? Because what works for one person isn't always going to be what works for the other person. And I'm sure this is something that you see in the research as well. And this brings up an important point because we're on this topic, which
Yeah.
is, the value of science when it comes to investigating questions and dismissing false narratives, specifically when it comes to assumptions on chronic adaptations taken from an acute study.
Man, that's very good question. And sometimes I think I question myself like, am I doing a good service when I go to those podcasts and people quite often hear from me that the powerlifters and bodybuilders, they didn't need us. They didn't. We started to do those studies to understand and figure it out, and pretty much answering questions. But to be honest, science is the best approach we have to answer questions. Science is the systematic way that we answer question utilizing the scientific method. And your field is based upon experimentation and empirical findings. So we come up with hypotheses. We're going to randomize groups or conditions. Those people will undergo different treatments. We're going to observe, test it out, hypothesis, and then we can either support or disprove a false narrative claim or a hypothesis that was legit in the past. Some, because again, that it always goes back to the leap in the logic. We learned from textbooks. They are great. They're great foundation. Just going back again on lengthening partials, people don't know the basics sometimes. I know most people consuming, they don't need to be worried about anatomy, kinesiology, but some researchers are referring to something as lengthening partials, and you look at anatomy and what you know, like I don't think there's a lengthening partial exercise. It's right, like is bicep with shoulder flexion lengthening partials. If you it's like a, but I think that again, going back to your question, quite often, and those we tested out so many hypotheses that way, right? Like that's in the test book that a physiological process supposed to happen this way, but then when we test it out, right, the hormone responses, how for how long the training always was short rest interval to spike testosterone and growth hormone responses. For how long people trained based upon assumption that training for hypertrophy, the primary a proxy of a good hypertrophy training would be huge hormonal responses, and that was debunked. And again, how was debunked? Through science, through scientific method, to observation, empirical findings. I think science, especially in applied field, is the most reliable way to, again, prove support or disprove a hypothesis or a false claim narrative. That's the best tool we have. I must say, it's not perfect, as everything in life, but science has a remarkable ability to correct itself. It does, because if you put out a paper that's a crap, or the paper might be retracted, or other people are going to replicate that paper, or questioning the methods. Like we always checking each other all the time. Like we submit our paper to publication, we have a peer reviewing again, right? How the meta-analysis about lengthening partials was published. That's a good question, but I must say, I hear the frustration. To be honest, if you, I don't know, if you ask people out there, because I have a biased opinion based on my environment, but I hear the frustration that, oh, people are so tired to how the, not science, but the word science has been used on social media. Everything now should be scientific validated, and they do the thumbnails with a science now, right? Science is killing our games, or the most scientific technique. It's like a, for a scientist, when they read such things, or because the students, they send me those, when I came across with the leg extension as the worst exercise for quadriceps, I was like, and I stopped the video when the guy started to talk about the Smith machine. Like, I'm done. Like, I have a responsibility. I don't feel comfortable in front of camera. I to really, when I started receiving like invites to be on podcasts, like, man, I think it's my responsibility. I know I'm not big fan, but I gotta do something. At least, like, I don't have the reach of those guys, but I gotta do something about it and show a different perspective. So again, I keep saying that those powerlifters and bodybuilders, they figured it out how to be stronger and bigger before we started to do our studies. But the scientific method, or science, is the most reliable way, especially in our field, that we do experimentation and empirical, right? We do data collection, and then you can compare from effectiveness standpoint or efficient standpoint, intervention A versus B. But I said that, and I'm going to repeat myself again. The strength of our conclusions come from a collective body of well-conducted research. Science is not perfect. Science is not telling you how you're supposed to train. Science is giving you the framework, right? Science is giving to coaches and practitioners like the framework. Literally, that's the toolbox. And you, as a coach, considering, right, your anecdotal experience, the client preferences, you're gonna be use what science has provided as the framework. Again, we're not trying. I'm a scientist, and my motivation was never prove someone is wrong, or proving I was right all along. Was never such a thing. My motivation is always advance the field through answering questions in the most precise way my designs and my research projects allow me to do. So again, it's science is the most reliable, is the best tool. It's not perfect, but like I said, it has the impressive ability to correct itself. So
Love that. Great point. And just because you brought it up, the leg extension, I try not to get too involved in different arguments on social media, because disagreements and people's feelings get hurt.
yeah,
But me as a coach, I would feel embarrassed making something with such a definitive claim. And I've read a lot of papers. I've tried to keep up with the literature over the years. Like, all the papers I've read, they almost never give me a definitive answer for anything. It's always like, hey, we kind of have an idea of things moving in this direction. We're open for discussion, and that allows me, okay, maybe let me try to tweak something this way. Maybe I'll tweak something this way. Maybe I'll try it for myself first and see how that works. And then I'll implement it with clients.
be our own lab. I keep saying that. Be our own lab.
I love that. I'm going to start using that. Be your own lab. And I think that's a good practice for a lot of coaches to, if they're not implementing, implement. And if you don't know how to read research, go read research reviews, people who break it down for you, or people that you trust will present information in an honest manner, not because they are author on a paper and they have kind
Yeah.
of a bias going behind it. I don't want to assume people's motives. But just saying. So,
Yeah,
so
man.
to
Oh, yeah.
segue this in another direction, I know that we've been touching a little bit on longer muscle length training, and then this kind of bleeds into another topic
Mhm.
of stretch mediated hypertrophy. So, are some muscle groups more susceptible to the stimulus obtained from training at a longer muscle length or that stretch, whether it be like the calves or biarticular muscles?
Oh man, that's a good question, but I don't want to let you down. I don't have an answer here because again, and we are limited to the data we have, and the data we have is very limited to a few muscle groups. And again, because like it is easier to assume that if a muscle has a longer fascicle length, uh, would be more challenge. Is that like again like a is that more challenge to stretch mediating hypertrophy taking place, or vice versa? Again, we need, because it seems that as long as stretch is enough to provide mechanical tension to stimulate protein synthesis, muscle should grow. And again, the whole thing started with the seminal work from Professor Jose Antonio. Uh, was like I probably you probably heard about that already. Was tubular resistance training, which they had quails, and then they put the quails' wings inside the tube, stretched out the wings, and loaded up to 30% of the quail's body weight, and they found a huge muscle growth. And then people back then did the leap and logic. You should stretch the muscles now. You're gonna maximize growth because we had one study in birds. But and that study, and people also used to say that hey, stretching also might produce hyperplasia, that increasing fiber number, which we don't have evidence supporting that. So but going back to your question, like I don't know if a certain because if you think about the muscles, the fibers are not freely swimming inside your muscles. They are wrapped in the connective tissue we call individual, right? To have a individual fibers. Your muscle has thousands of muscle fiber. Each individual fiber is wrapped with a connective tissue, and then have the fascicle that is kind of the bundle of 150 muscle fibers. So and some muscles, especially the fuse form, when the fascicle runs parallel to the line of pull, the tendon, those muscles, sometimes the fascicles are a little longer. But most of our muscles, your delt is a multipinnate. The rectus femoris is a bipinnate. And the pinnate comes from Latin feather, and your biceps literally looks like a feather. So a pinnate muscle, that means the fibers run angle to the line of pull. So, and again, usually those muscles, the fascicles are a little longer. We can do that in the lab because if I have the fascicle right here, if I have the tendon right here and I put the ultrasound, I can see where the fascicle starts. But as long as I measure the angle, which is the penatial angle, when you are training, because you are adding, that's another thing we can talk, because in the past, people assume stretch mediated hypertrophy was more a means of a serial muscle hypertrophy, adding sarcomeres in series, but when the muscle also adds sarcomeres in parallel. So that means when you have the muscle is right here, right? And then I measure the thickness. But then I can see the white striations right here. Each one is a fascicle. So as long as I measure the thickness right here, right? And I measure the angle. Then I use something people hated from high school, trigonometry, and pretty much I can I know the angle, because I know the angle, and I know the height of my triangle, the opposite side. It's pretty much I know my fascicle length, my hypotenuse. That's not rocket science. It's pretty basic stuff. So you can calculate the fascicle length. So again, just telling that some muscles fascicle lengths, they're like 2-3 inches. Some muscles might be a little bit longer, depends on the muscle architecture. So definitely we need more studies. That because I told you, to make such a claim about lengthening biased exercises, we need more studies with different muscle groups, and based on anatomy, architecture, fascicle length, and all the things I mentioned. Probably not all muscles or every muscle would benefit from lengthening bias exercise. I think a safer or better approach is utilizing different exercises with a different resistance profile, short lengthening bias, and so on. But something else about to say about stretch-mediated hypertrophy. There is a famous guy, he's not famous because he's famous in the research field. Because some people are famous on social media and they call themselves researcher, but I never read a paper from them. And that guy is not famous. And that guy is not famous on social media. Wernick is the guy with stretching-inducing hypertrophy. And he found radial muscle growth because he didn't measure fascicle length, he measured thickness, and he found that stretching, but again, very hardcore stretching. We can also talk more about stretch-mediated hypertrophy, but the last study with a chest, the pec muscles, they built a device and they did 15 minutes stretch straight. So again, they held people in the device, and not everyone wanted to be in that group. They stated, as that's what a good researcher does, states the limitations of the paper that was not truly randomized because not everyone wanted to be in that group. But again, he found that rolling again was 15 minutes, and they adjusted because they measured the tensile force, was pretty cool, and then like it kept going down, and then they adjusted again just to have a proxy of a tension. So 15 minutes stretch straight 4 times per week, or I think what the other study he did was he called very long lasting stretching was 7 days per week, 1 hour stretching. And that was like for calves, they use a device they called orthosis that hold in the plantar flexion, like in the dorsiflexion, right? Like a stretching. But again, that raises the question. So is that the novelty of stimulus? Because and that's another thing you need to, because when it comes to lengthening bias recommendation, I think, especially when you study training people, what you are doing before might impact the outcome in the study. For example, if you are utilizing primary short bias exercises, and then you assign to a group with a lengthening bias, was the lengthening bias that produced the effect, or was the novelty of the stimulus? So that's the same thing when you look at the stretch-mediated hypertrophy studies. The cool thing about that study, I keep saying that hypertrophy, so many things can generate hypertrophy. There are so many countless ways to produce mechanical tension sufficient enough to stimulate protein synthesis. Again, we need to advance mechanism from a mechanistic standpoint, because some people are like, yeah, as long as the stretch is able to unfold tighten is a huge structure protein. As long as the stretch is able to unfold that might lead to triggering anabolic stimulus responses and muscle growth and so on. But we definitely need to advance more. But I think, yeah, stretching depending on the type of intervention, the training status, even the guy with a trained people, again, like we didn't know the type of a training they were doing before the study. But even in trained people, stretching for 1 hour on a daily basis, that grows muscle. Again, that's practical. Not at all, in my opinion. Like, why am I going to spend 1 hour stretching if, from a range of motion standpoint, meta-analysis also has shown that range of motion gains is comparable if you only do static stretching versus resistance training. Because what is range of motion? Ability to move your joints through their full range of motion. That's what we do with resistance training, right? That's what we do pretty much. So again, we know that stretch, depending on certain circumstances, yes, can grow muscle. Now you should stretch everything, all the muscles, implement stretching for all the muscles. That's the leap in logic we should avoid.
Mm, mm. Fantastic points. And just to summarize a bit, man, I could pull up like at least like 10 publications that show a positive benefit from stretching in terms of either range of motion or slightly beneficial towards muscle growth. And
Yeah, no, we do have it, like a range of motion.
I,
No, go ahead. Sorry.
no, all good. I just love your cautiousness in expressing your, thoughts or what you could pull from a certain data, because that's not something that's really apparent on social media, and
No.
you discuss the limitations quite beautifully.
Yeah, man. I think I keep saying. I published one study for the last topic I have been studying is volume, and we published we published I published 3 studies, one collaboration, the infamous 52. That was the Dr. Pack. He one day we were talking, and I love the infamous, like he called the infamous paper. But we published one paper before that, and you have 4 more papers in the pipeline. And that because I told you, like back then, I used to say like volume is a primary driver of muscle hypertrophy. It's like there are way more nuances here. There are way more unknowns. We know we there are a bunch of things we know already, but I keep studying and like there are way more things that I don't know. I don't have an answer. It's like I know it's like a cliche sometimes, but that's I think that's what a good researcher is supposed to do is like keep question. I'm the first to question myself, and I have way more questions after doing this for almost 20 years at this point. My first publication in JSCR was 2007. So again, after doing this for almost 20 years, I have a way more questions now than 20 years ago.
I think that says a lot, given you have what, like 80 plus publications.
Yeah, getting there, I guess. It's getting there.
Getting there. Well, I'm excited to, stay following along some of the papers that you put out, and I want to thank you for being someone who is honest in the industry and doesn't mind talking about limitations. And I want to thank you again for your time and coming on. I know we have some time constraints we should be aware of. Is there anything you'd like to leave the audience with? How can they follow you and keep up with you?
Oh, yeah, sure. I'm not so active on social media. I like to put some content out there sometimes, and for good or for bad, like if I lose followers, it doesn't change my income or myself, so I don't have that bias. So when I put something, I always try to study about the topic. It's something I read already and try to show the broader picture. I think that's something really really important. Uh, I think that don't get me wrong, we are way better. We have a way more quality information. I think it's just getting harder for the general audience to filter, to find the good information in the middle of so much noise and misinformation. But if someone is interested to see what I put out there, okay, once in a while, yeah, I created my Instagram 4 years ago, and that's my last is Dr. De Souza .eo, and also I'm on Twitter as well. So again, those are the outlets people can find me sometimes, and sharing some content, research we publish, the projects. We are really excited about new projects, new research, collaborations. And again, it's hard to balance off the husband, dad, professor, and mentor, and it's a lot. I appreciate people who dedicate like a time to educate others on social media and put a good quality content. Because every time I try to do a post, it takes me too much time, because like man, I need to provide all nuances. What is the bigger picture, the state of art, the and I get it. Quite often people just want to know what is better for this, right? What is better to me? What is more? And yeah, unfortunately, you have so many people there serving that purpose, right? To solve all their problems in the really fast, quick pace, and yeah. But anyway, but yeah, if someone is interesting, yeah, they can find me on Instagram, Twitter, and thank you for having me, for giving me opportunity to speak a little bit about research and my perspective. I think it's important, and but for people who are gonna listen to this, you always should question everyone besides title, whatever. Don't hesitate in question myself as well. I think that's always a good exercise.
Mm. Thank you again for coming on, Doc. And if you guys enjoyed the episode, don't forget to take a screenshot and tag us on your stories, and stay tuned for the future episode. Talk soon, team.